Hello, everybody, and welcome to part 2 of the BISA Johannesburg webinar series, Combating COVID-19, an Irish Business Response in South Africa. Once again, I'm John Greene, Chairman of BISA Joburg, and I'll be your host for today. So firstly, I'd like to welcome our distinguished panel of guests. We've got Adrian Saville, the Chief Executive of Cannon Asset Managers and Professor of Economics at the Gordon Institute of Business Science. We've also got Dominic MacSorley, Chief Executive of Concern Worldwide, and his colleagues James Kitt, Corporate Partnerships Manager, and Edwin Mbugua, Health and Nutrition Expert from Concern in Kenya. And lastly, we've got Ivor Queally, the Chief Executive of QK Meats, joining us. So I'd also like to welcome everybody dialed in remotely from around the world. Last time we had 5 different countries, so it was great to see so many different people from around the world actually dialed in. So our theme for today's webinar will be mobilizing the private sector. And we'll hear some fascinating insights which will resonate with many of our diverse membership base by discussing the economic impact, the humanitarian impact, and the supply chain impact of COVID-19. So a lot has actually happened since our last webinar, which was only last week, and which bizarrely feels like both a long time and a short time ago. With South Africa having entered the 4th week of lockdown, 500,000 more people infected by COVID-19 globally, up to 2.5 million now. There's been another severe market event with the historic crash in the WTI oil price. And then only on Tuesday, there was a 500 billion rand stimulus package unveiled by Cyril Ramaphosa. So a huge amount has actually happened in the last week. So it's great to be able to follow up with another webinar. And I've been reading a lot lately that there's been a lot of introspective commentaries written. And many businesses which are able to operate remotely, which is like financial services, for example, and then promoting a lot of mindfulness above almost everything else, which perhaps is indicating a dramatic shift in human behavior is actually underway. And it's become more and more apparent that the world will no longer be the same once we emerge from this pandemic, and that the global economy will not just reopen for business and everything will be instantly back to normal. So I'd like to once again thank my committee at BISA Joburg, and in particular Angie Williams and David Delaney, who've been instrumental in making this series happen. And it's really been a team effort so far, and I can assure you that there are great new innovative plans underway to keep topical and business networking events coming your way regardless of the lockdown restrictions. So do keep an eye on our social media. It's the BISA LinkedIn pages. We've got a group and a company page, and also the website, which is businessireland.coza. If we have time today, at the end of the call, I'd like to host a brief Q&A with our concerned delegates, James and Edwin. So if you have any questions for them, please post them on the chat during the webinar as we're going through, and I'll pick them up at the end and we can see what those guys have to add. So to kick off, I'm delighted to introduce our first guest of the day, and new to BISA. He's the founder and chief executive of Cannon Asset Managers, who's a multidisciplinary buy-side investment manager, and he's also a professor of economics, finance, and strategy at the Gordon Institute of Business Science in Johannesburg. So welcome, Mr. Adrian Saville.
Johnny, thank you. Thanks for hosting me this afternoon, and it's great to be with you. I've never been introduced as I think you said, multidisciplinary buy-side. That's a first in an intro, but I will take it. I've got some slides that I'd like to share. You've given to me 5 questions to work through, but I thought before going to those specific questions, I'd give you sort of my lens on the environment. And also to that end, let me share with you the screen, and I trust you have this picture now.
Let's see.
Let me try again.
Is it coming up there? Oh yeah, it's coming up now.
You got it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, great. Just to double check, you've still got my pictures?
We do.
Before I start ranting. Okay. So, I thought before jumping into the 5 specific questions that you put to me, Johnny, which range from the likelihood of an employment recovery as we come through the deep impacts of COVID-19 through to, a search for any silver lining. I'll address all 5 of those specifically, but I thought it would be useful just to first give some lens or context. On the left-hand side of the screen, you see here expected economic growth of various countries, regions at the start of the year, then at slowdown, and then through the course of the Great Lockdown. For the world economy, the IMF expects -3% growth this year, which would represent the sharpest decline since the 1930s. For South Africa, the IMF expects -5.8, and that is the sharpest decline we have on record. So regardless of, almost irrespective of who we're talking about, the impacts are deep, they're wide-ranging, and they've come out of nowhere, which means many businesses, governments, institutions, regulators, policymakers have been caught off guard. And South Africa is no exception there. On the right-hand side, I'm sharing with you some of the work we've been doing on trying to figure out the impacts on the budget deficit. I'm sharing with you all of the data for the sake of completeness, and you're welcome to share these slides with anyone on this attention to the bottom fiscal deficit and the amount of money missing. Now, the amount of money missing isn't the budget deficit, but rather the money we had versus what has been the money we had promised versus what we now look like. And the budget deficit now comes in at something like 13% GDP, with 300 billion rand missing in action. That's before any emergency packages. So these numbers make for very, very sobering reading. -6% economic growth, -13% budget deficit. And then along with this, we've had Moody's and Fitch both put South Africa down a notch in creditworthiness, and the rand has moved from 14 rand at the beginning of the year to 19 rand today. The impacts go from economy to business to society, typically in that order. And so the next chart that I'm showing you is the impact on profitability, but I'm using here MSCI all world data. So this is for 2,500 global companies. The relationship between company profit growth, the blue line, and economic growth, the gray column, isn't quite one-to-one, but it maps quite closely, and it helps me with a throwaway observation as an economist and an investment manager that one of the most important ingredients to business success is the economy. And if we are heading into -3 economic growth or a 3% contraction, we could infer from this that corporate profitability is likely to decline by something in the order of 70% year on year. So business profit falls 70% between 2019 and 2020. It's a staggering decline and substantially bigger than global financial crisis.
Wow.
Sorry?
Yeah, go on, continue.
Okay. And I haven't shown you the South African data. We've got similar data for South Africa. We've got a similar read-through for South Africa. That corporate profitability will step off a cliff. And we already have some anecdotal evidence. Statistics South Africa did a survey. They released the results of that survey. They make for glib reading. I'm sharing with you here just sort of 3 anecdotes. The top left is from Yoko. which is a digital transactions business. They help small businesses with processing transactions. Yoko shows you the impact across a range of sectors: food, drink, hospitality, healthcare, beauty, fitness, retail. And lockdown week 1 and week 2, I don't have their data for week 3, but it shows you a decline in the order of 80% at the small business level. That's in revenue. Underneath that is a consumer survey from the credit organization TransUnion. This makes for equally harrowing reading, ranging from "I've lost my job," "I own a small business," "orders have dried up," "my work hours have been reduced," and the impacts are material. And then on the right-hand side is a stat that I'm drawing from Ruth Hall. She's from PLAS, which is the Land and Agricultural entity. And Ruth Hall estimates that as many as 5.5 million informal workers have lost their jobs so far. And those 5.5 million informal workers, she suspects, support 16 million lives. We think that when all this is said and done, we will be looking at least 1 million jobs lost in the formal sector. And so, we can go then, Johnny, to your first question. And I'm going to flip to, what I'll call my notes, because I think it'll help discipline me. Just in terms of time management, your question to me was, of the informal workers who've lost their jobs, how many do you think will bounce back to employment post-pandemic? If I can take the liberty of including a formal sector along with your informal sector, and that would be the 1 million plus the 5.5 million. There is a good chance that the recovery is L-shaped rather than V-shaped. Even if it is V-shaped, it will be a recovery to very anemic growth. Adding 1 million to the formal sector unemployed pool would take South Africa's unemployment rate to about 33.5%, one of the highest in the world. The prospect to recover the unemployment, to answer your question then directly, hinges on not just a V-shaped recovery, but getting onto a higher growth plateau and making sure that that higher growth plateau isn't just fast growth, but inclusive growth with small and medium enterprise orientation. That is the employment engine of any economy, and South Africa is no exception. Your second question, I'm just going to run from here, and you'll put questions to me at the end, if that's okay with you.
Yes, sure.
Thank you. Your second question was, does the SARB have anything left in their arsenal to stimulate the economy? At this point, it would be fairly funny if I told you that I was a Wolves supporter from a history where we remember football being played. But okay, you can do Arsenal. I'll do Wolves. It doesn't even get a chuckle, so I'll work harder. South Africa went into this week with a very anemic fiscal stimulus. We had less than 2% on the table as a percentage of GDP. And that compared to the United States with 10% of GDP and Japan with 20% of GDP. We've caught up, and the left-hand chart, map, shows you South Africa joining the pink guys, which is a 10 to 100 billion stimulus, but it actually equates to about 10% of South Africa's GDP. That was the announcement of Tuesday night. We need to be careful in inferring that that is new cash spending. A lot of it isn't. 130 billion is reprioritized spending. 200 billion is a guarantee from financial institutions in loans, and 70 billion is tax that has been moved around, deferred for all intents and purposes. In fact, then, this 500 billion stimulus is really only 100 billion in new money. It's an extraordinary display of policy ingenuity, if I could put it in those terms. So our fiscal wiggle room is very, very small, and we will bring, I think, more than the 100 billion, which critically goes to the young and the unemployed, the most fragile parts of South Africa's society, it is a fresh 100 billion, but more than that 100 billion and the other ingredients that were already there but not pointed to, I think it brings a sense of stability and sanity and helps establish confidence, which is absolutely fundamental in this environment. And so the Reserve Bank has been at the table. It started the year with a 0.25% interest rate cut and has since added 2 1% rate cuts. It's extraordinary for the Reserve Bank to move in steps of this size. And it was particularly unusual the last step because it was not only a 1% cut, but between meetings. We think that they still have some firepower. If we take it in absolute terms, they've got 4.25% of firepower. But the Reserve Bank is by its nature extremely conservative. They are highly regarded internationally as a monetary policy manager. And so we think that they're likely to hold the line and probably do something like 0.25%, 25 basis points in Q3, Q4, and Q1. So they've moved fast, they've moved impressively, and perhaps now it's time for a bit of wait and see. And then let me be
maybe jump in there. I think it's interesting to see then that the gap that you identified in the GDP is actually, a lot of it has been, they're taking action to plug it quite quickly. And the gap's obviously a bit more long-term as well, and maybe a bit of a lagged indicator, but having that 10% approximately of GDP stimulus package up front from the various different investors seems like a very proactive move anyway. So I think just in the interest of time, if we could maybe jump to the silver linings that you see with all the doing that we've talked about. It'd be good to hear about what positives may come from this.
Absolutely. So we'll use some other time to talk about what the asset management industry has learned. If I could make the very quick observation that what is unusual about this crisis is it's running from the real economy to the financial economy, which is very different to all of the previous crises. Certainly I've had the experience with over the last 25 years or so. And so is there anything that we can learn from previous crises and silver linings? The learnings, I'll just leave the observation with you that I think Jared Diamond in his recent book, Upheaval, in reviewing the experience of other countries with crisis, is a fantastic place to go and learn what has happened in other places and what the markers and responses to crisis look like and the form that they take. The silver lining that I'm going to give you is Tito Mboweni. What COVID-19 has given him, whether you're a conspiracy theorist or not, is the latitude to move. And it has given him the directive to implement the structural adjustment.
Dealt with the crisis in our home offices to a depth before it's even hit to the same extent across our countries of operation. So our offices in New York, in Dublin, our offices in South Korea and London uniquely are going through this crisis, while at the same time trying to support the prevention methods globally. Our four priorities really are the protection and health and protection of our staff, with 4,000 staff working across 24 countries. The second one, importantly, is to continue the kind of life-saving work around hunger, livelihoods, agriculture that we have been running to the extent possible, and to adapt that where possible. And that's been a challenge. Thirdly is to support local and national strategies on COVID prevention. And then finally, I think, and it's really what's really interesting about Adrian and the previous discussion around this, the impact of this on a whole kind of economic recovery. To draw it in, I think we've been drawing quite a lot of our learning from Ebola and the kind of adaptation that we did there successfully. I think it's really important that we look at the impact that this is having on the kind of poorest, more vulnerable sectors of society. Certainly what we've learned in there is that there's a huge amount that can be done in relation to community mobilization, around the installation of water points, around the provision of soap, hygiene kits. Where you can't continue with schools education, we worked successfully in Sierra Leone before, we're doing it again. to ensure that those kind of classes can be adapted over the radio and continued. So the use of technology, the use of this kind of thing has become an increasingly important part of how we respond. And predominantly within that is the use of cash. Cash was used very, very successfully to support highly vulnerable communities in the Horn of Africa food security, used and adapted to protect the same communities in the COVID crisis. So I think a key point is to point out what is possible within a hugely challenging, and at the same time recognize kind of what we are not able to achieve. At the starting point of this, I suppose, prior to COVID-19, there was 180 million people across the globe that were dependent on a very insufficiently resourced humanitarian lifeline. And the latest appeal that's gone out from the UN Global Humanitarian Overview of 31 billion is, at this point, less than 2 billion of that has been received. So we're in this kind of space where, you know, extraordinary measures are being made by national governments in relation to huge economic supports. But I think we have to make sure that we're keeping the eye on trying to fund what it was already a deeply unfunded humanitarian lifeline, whether it's to the refugees in the Rohingya inside Syria, those in Central African Republic. I would say that two things that we have learned in terms of what's really worked well. First of all, I want to acknowledge the continued support of the private sector that we've had through Accenture, through the Kerry Group, through the likes of Zurich. They have been very, very close partners of concern in a program that we have been rolling out with smallholder farmers across 17 countries in Africa, reaching 550,000, which is around conservation agriculture, climate smart agriculture, improving the productivity, reducing the labor of predominantly female-headed households, to the point where we did a study with Trinity, recognizing that women were able to save 34 days a year as a result of these, while at the same time increasing their yield. Now, those kind of programs are critical for us to keep going, particularly in these times. Two things I think worked really well in terms of crisis, and I think it's worth noting. During the earthquake in Haiti, there was a lot of private sector wanted to come in importantly and provide assistance. The mechanisms with the UN and the NGOs is a very kind of peculiar animal if you haven't worked with it before. It's around clusters, it's around all of these different types of mechanisms. And what actually emerged from that through the Clinton Foundation was created this space where you brought private sector, international and national, NGOs, representatives government, who met every 6 weeks inside Port-au-Prince and talked about what can we do as a collective that isn't going to overlap but will complement the work of the kind of UN structures. And it was hugely successful, and it was led actually by a corporate lead, Irish one, that drove in that kind of level of, because I remember you were held to account under this kind of fairly rigorous kind of corporate ruling every 6 weeks. The second thing where I've seen that work is in Kenya, where Irish Aid is working in close partnerships with the Irish business community around agriculture. And it's creating those kind of mechanisms that I believe actually we should be now replicating in different countries, where we create that space where private sectors are represented in a place that can be challenging, whether it's Chad or Tanzania or Zambia, and creating that space with national players, and actually looking at tangible ways that we can collectively tackle kind of the obstacles. So I leave it at that. I think this is a really important discussion. I would love to be continued, or for us to be continued part of that, and even would welcome an opportunity, even if we could kind of create some of these cells for anybody that would be interested at a country level. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dominic. I think it'd be great to share some of your insights, maybe on our social media and things, on the different challenges, like you were saying, with the 180 million already dependent on humanitarian aid, that now that's made even more difficult. And what you've kind of experienced before with Ebola, with the diverting of the funds into the COVID-19 response, or how that actually affects. So maybe at the end we can see how you could maybe give some advice to the members on how their private sector firms could actually get involved and contribute, because we've seen some great things, initiatives in South Africa, like from the Gauteng MECs who are setting up a temporary hospital in Nazareth. They're appealing to businesses for certain products, not necessarily just cash. And then also, you know, companies being able to divert some of their community support initiative funding into the response here. And maybe there's like you were saying, in some of the other countries and up in Kenya, things where with the locust plague, and that you might need to actually focus on some other areas and bolster that funding. So we'll definitely share some information with the members on that. And actually, I'd just like to say thanks, Dominic. Concern have actually reached out to us and James to spark this whole webinar series. So it's brilliant to see such a proactive Irish NGO acting like so impactfully in Africa. And also recently I just saw the President of Ireland, Michael D. Higgins, had some very inspiring words about Africa, and it's no doubt bolstered your efforts and given extra support for your cause here. So I think hopefully, you know, you're definitely not forgotten about, and it's great to see all the work you're doing here in Africa. So I'd just like to invite our members again to just put up some questions for Dominic's team, for James and Edwin, so we can hopefully get to them at the end. We're running a bit over time, but I'm just going to bring in Ivor Queally now for a quick 10 minutes. He'll be familiar to many of you, and he's been a supporter of many Irish initiatives over the years in South Africa, and he's leading a shining example of an Irish business successfully integrated into the South African economy. He's the Chief Executive of QK Meats, and welcome, Mr. Ivor Queally.
Good morning, Johnny. Good morning to everybody. When myself and Johnny had a conversation regarding today's chat, I thought that it'd be better just to keep it in a much more informal format and allow people more with a Q&A session. But maybe just to start off with some of the things, we started to look at what was happening in Europe about 2 to 3 weeks before the reality kicked in South Africa. So we started to proactively preempt what was coming down the road. And when we look at it, there was a huge run on getting basic things like laptops and making sure a large number of your staff were going to be able to work from home remotely. And within a week before lockdown, we started seeing laptops being completely sold out. Trying to get a large number of our staff to get decent internet connectivity as we tried to figure out what staff members could work from home, what staff would actually come in and rotate that would maybe work 2 or 3 days at home and 2 or 3 days from the office, and what staff couldn't work from at home. So we started splitting shifts. In addition to following what best practice was in Ireland, we were also identified at a very early stage with the South African government, with the COVID command center, that they had identified our operations as being one of the more critical ones for food supply chain and delivery. So we had been working a couple of weeks before the president's speech on lockdown. So there was an awful lot of pre-preparation going on with the government behind the scenes before the announcement came. Then when we see when the president's announcement came, a huge amount of information came onto the scene, trying to understand and interpret labor law. As a company that was going to remain open and continue to produce food, we had to be very conscious from a health and safety perspective that if we had a potential exposure where one of our staff members ended up in getting COVID-19, and how that would impact other staff. So you had to be very conscious of how you were going to be legally compliant and mitigate the exposure for the business. We also had to look at an understanding the funding and the different stimulus packages that the government was doing. So I'm sure most people are very familiar with the whole UIF package and how that works, that if certain businesses were going on a complete close down, what government packages were available for the payment of those staff. And there was a number of packages that the government had offered, whether it was a 2-day week, 3-day week, permanent, and analysing and understanding that. There was also a large amount of contradictory information that was coming out. So you would have, initially, our biggest concern with shutdown was getting our staff to and from work. And the government came out initially and said, well, taxis were only going to be allowed to have 50% of the occupancy. Then it went up to 70%, and then it was 100% as long as they had face masks. And then there was U-turns. So you're constantly trying to keep yourself updated. A lot of people might not be familiar of some of the regulations that were gazetted relation to the Competition Authority and anti-competitive behaviour, where you couldn't have substantial increases. And even though raw materials or availability of raw materials, some people were taking advantage of the situation. So government had to bring in regulations that you couldn't have prices increasing exponentially. So a large number of retailers have refused to take any kind of price increases, which is correct and right at the moment. We spent a lot of time understanding legislation, new legislation, where now it's using face masks is going to become more and more apparent, and using face masks and the cleaning regime, and staff, when we come into the workplace, how we're testing staff for temperature. And as they arrive in, we are consistently and constantly are checking people for temperature, sending people home if we believe that people have a cough or a sneeze, because we just cannot afford to bring the potential risk into our business of spreading COVID-19. Other things that happened, which we, about letters, because our staff are all deemed to be essential services, we had to make sure that we had letters that would be given to each and every staff member that could be shown to the relevant police authorities, the army, and so on. And the first day or two, we had a number of issues, particularly some of the staff coming from Tembiso, Soweto, Alexandria, in trying to get out and come to work. But again, it's just a continuous mitigating of the risks that was out there. We believe that, like 9/11, there is going to be a number of changes to how we will continue to live our lives and how we travel. 9/11 has fundamentally changed forever how we travel, as will COVID have a fundamental impact on how we meet and talk to people. If I take myself on a personal level, I never used a Microsoft Teams meeting. Today I find myself doing 6, 7, 8 times a day Microsoft Teams meeting. This is something that has been born out of necessity, as opposed to something that was a nice to have 6 weeks ago. And I think fundamentally how we work and operate going forward is going to have huge changes in the business.
Yeah, for sure. And in your line of business, what percentage of people roughly now are deemed essential workers to be actually having to leave their home and go into work versus the ones that can actually work from home? Because we heard from Ian Kirk last week that it was roughly 85% of his staff were working from home, with the remainder 15 in the office. So I'd imagine it's kind of something like the opposite with you, is it?
It's the absolute opposite. When we looked at this, there was only 2 or 3 departments that we could actually say could work remotely from home, because ours is predominantly a manufacturing processing. So all our staff on the factory floor continues to come to work. Our maintenance team still have to come in. So it's probably closer to 90% of our staff still come to work. And 10% be it the administration function, be it the financial departments, the HR department, the sales and marketing departments, they can all work remotely. but the vast majority of our staff, whether it's in the manufacturing of food or even in supply chain, because a much larger part of our business is involved in the supply chain, working with ShopRite, Checkers, Pick n Pay, Woolworths, in making sure that there is a route to market for their products.
Yeah, and in that kind of note then, I think lastly, with your supply chain and the impact that it's had on that, have you found any kind of big challenges of late after you've kind of gotten over the initial shock of, you know, the whole shutdown and the movement of goods and services around? I think now, what kind of challenges are you seeing with the supply chain?
I think probably the most fundamental thing that we've seen is initially, when the announcement was made of lockdown, there was a massive uptick, and the demand, it was as if the retailers or supermarkets were never going to have food again, because the wave of people going in and stocking up on products. That lasted for about a 2-week period, after which then there's been a complete collapse in demand at retail level, that just the demand had spiked maybe 30-40%, and then it reduced back down again. We've now also seen in the last week or 10 days, the South African consumer has started to become much more financially constrained and under pressure, and money has become tighter, and we're seeing a continuous erosion, and it'll be very interesting to see next week how the consumer is going to react when they get their month-end salary. Also, other shopping patterns have completely changed. Typically, people would go out shopping on a Saturday and Sunday. That's finished. So now we're seeing larger spikes on a Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday. So the norms, the old norms don't exist. It's very, very difficult to plan, and you're continuously having to adjust new spikes or changes.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I think like that volatility in demand that you're seeing now, it's like something obviously that you've never seen before. And if it does change the whole way of working afterwards, with people, a lot more people working from home and being maybe a bit more flexible with their shopping, it's going to obviously change a lot for you with your cold storage and delivering that fresh food. So I wish you best of luck, I think, with all this volatility. But it's great to see QK Meats there being one of the essential services and keeping the country running. And thanks a million, Ivor, for your time. I know this is an unbelievably crazy time for you as well, so really appreciate it. And I think I'd just like to thank as well Dominic, MacSorley and Adrian Saville as well for their time today. I'd like to maybe just, before we have a look at the Q&A, I'd just like to let everyone know that the final installment of this series is going to take place next week, and we're going to discuss, among some other things, planning beyond COVID-19, if that's possible. And as news kind of now emerges of economies slowly reopening, I think it's the right time to maybe discuss the private sector planning on what are we going to do, and how's ways of working going to change, like we've been discussing today with the panelists. So I'm not sure if James and Edwin, if you're there, if you can see some of the questions posed on the chat. I'm just on my phone, so I need to press a few buttons. But if maybe we could bring in Edwin and James. And then they could maybe take a look at some of the questions by some of the people who've dialed in, and then we'll wrap up in maybe 2 or 3 minutes.
Thank you very much, John. This is Edwin from Concern, and thank you for inviting us for this very good discussion, and it is very timely. I wanted to talk about or address a question on from Nicola Kelly about the cash flow being tight, and whether there are opportunities to support concerns, operations, e.g. technical assistance, and so on and so forth. Yes, I may speak for Kenya and some of the countries where Concern is working. Definitely those avenues are open, and as Dominic has mentioned, this is about fostering partnership between the NGOs, the private sector, in terms of contributing to some of the national policies around mitigating the impact of COVID-19. And some of the avenues to do this would be to leverage on the industry or the panelist expertise. For example, in supporting the acceleration of manufacture of personal protective equipment, which is a very big gap among our health workers in the health facilities and even among the community health volunteers. Accelerating manufacture of critical care devices, which is also a very big gap. I think there's a lot of conversation going on around the gap within the healthcare system in Africa in regards to managing critical care patients. So technical expertise, if the panelists who have technical capacity in terms of manufacture, that is very welcome. And of course, leveraging the kind of networks that the panelists maybe have. So for us, the doors are open. It's not just cash support. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Edwin. I think it'd be great then afterwards, after the webinar, we'll just have a little chat about exactly that, picking up like what kind of technical manufacturers might be able to aid you, and then some of the, like I mentioned earlier, some of the PPE equipment and the CSI initiatives and how they can be actually put to work to mobilize the private sector. I think we've run out of time a bit and everybody needs probably to get back to their day job. So thank you very much, Edwin, for your comments, and good luck in Kenya on the ground. I think we're all struggling obviously with balancing all of our plates, like I was saying, with multiple different issues happening with people's personal lives and people's work. So thank you everybody again for dialing in. Any questions that haven't been addressed during the call, please reach out to us. You can post it on social media or reach out to us directly. We try and get those questions answered, and hopefully then, Adrian, we can also share some of your content with our members afterwards. So thank you all for listening again. We went over time a little bit today, but I think it was absolutely fascinating. We got some new insights that we've not really heard before, and that some of the news outlets that we're watching are really covering it all. So thank you so much to all the panelists, and we'll see you all next week. So again, stay safe, and thank you all for joining.